I am the Executive Officer of Sociologist for Women in Society, Barrett Katuna. So welcome to you all. Thank you for paying attention to all of the emails I send out. And thank you for being here today for our first plenary of the 2021 SWS winter meeting. And it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Mignon Moore, President of SWS as of, I don't know how many hours ago, she became president. So thank you so much for welcoming our president. Mignon Moore is professor of sociology at Barnard College and Columbia University and chairs the sociology department at Barnard. And she's now president of SWS, as I mentioned. Her areas of expertise are in the fields of sexuality, race, gender, family, aging, and qualitative research methods. So welcome to Mignon, and I will give you the spotlight now.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to see you. Tonight, we are bringing to the dance floor, coming to the dance floor are those persons who we wanted to celebrate to start the first night of the weekend with 50 years of SWS changes over time and contributions to the discipline. So I wanted to have this first plenary session celebrate our golden anniversary, right? A half century of our organization's commitment to feminist principles and actively working to achieve a more just society. So tonight we're focusing on what SWS has helped the discipline of sociology accomplish over the past 50 years by celebrating those who were there in the beginning and by hearing from individuals who can share experiences about pivotal times in the organization's development. I would like to thank the 50th Anniversary Committee, Bandana Prokayatsa, Barrett Katuna, Shaniqua Simpson, Denise Segura, Jamie Hartless, Judith Lorber, Marlise Durr, Mary Romero, and Pamela Roby, co-chaired by Josephine Beokupetz and myself. The committee has worked diligently to design programming for both the 2020 and the 2021 meetings, and we acknowledge and appreciate their efforts. So for tonight's main event, the program committee has prepared a series of themes and questions for the plenary speakers. Instead of a moderator, each evening plenary will be guided by a celebrant provocateur. As the celebrant, they will officiate, and as the provocateur, they may trouble the waters, so to speak, by asking stimulating questions or responding to questions in unexpected ways. So they will keep all of us on our toes. Tonight, we have Adia Harvey Wingfield as our celebrant provocateur. And Adia is the 2018 past president of SWS, and she is currently the 2021 president of the Southern Sociological Society. She is the Mary Tylson Hemingway Professor of Arts and Sciences and the Associate Dean for Faculty Development at Washington University in St. Louis. And we are in great hands. I now turn over this session to Adia, and please greet her warmly. I don't know how we can do that, but maybe she can feel the warmth coming through Zoom.
I can. Thank you, Mignon, for that introduction, and thank you for asking me to be the moderator and provocateur for this really exciting panel. Before we start, I just want to offer a heads up. It's 7:22 in Central Time, which means that my kids are not yet asleep, so I'm just giving everyone a heads up that I don't really know what's going to happen while I'm trying to work. They are kind of used to this dynamic, but I hear a lot of noise in the background. I don't know if you all do too, but hopefully you'll bear with me with whatever game is happening in the room outside of here. So that said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the panelists for this presentation. Mignon has organized a really fantastic lineup of people who have a long history of experience and involvement with SWS to reflect on and talk about their experiences in leadership and with the organization and what changes they've seen and what evolutions they've seen and what contributions that the organization has made to the discipline over the past 50 years of its existence. So I'll go ahead and start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll move to the panel themes and questions and get it going. I'll start with Pamela Roby, who is here and was the 1978 and 1979 past president. We also have Shin, who was affiliated with the American Sociological Association as the Director of Minority Affairs, I think. And who's now at National Institutes of Health, right, Jean? Yes. And we also have Dana Britton, who is a past editor of Gender and Society. Barbara Rissman is here, who is the 2003 past president of SWS and the current editor of Gender and Society. Veronica Montez is also here, who is a past treasurer of the organization. And we also have Maggie Abraham, who is the 2018 International Sociological Association president. So welcome to all of you, and thanks for joining us. So I'd like to go ahead and jump right into the first topic. The panel is organized around both themes and questions. So there are themes that I'll introduce and then ask a question related to that theme, and then we'll give the panelists an opportunity to share their thoughts and respond. So theme number one focuses on the meaning of SWS for the discipline, for ASA, for sociology courses, sociological research, social activism, public sociology, feminism, things of that nature. And so the question related to that theme is as follows. What is significant about having a feminist organization within the discipline of sociology? What has SWS contributed to the discipline, meaning to the research and teaching of sociology, the advancement of scientific knowledge in the field of gender, to professional organizations like the American Sociological Association, to public sociology and social activism over the years and today? So I'd like to start with Shin to get us going on that question. And then after that, people should feel free to contribute their thoughts as follows. Shin, what are your thoughts about this?
Hey, thank you, Adia. Nice to see you, by the way. Hi, and hi to everybody. I was telling some folks before I got on that this is actually my first gathering of sociologists in almost a year, because I was at ASA, as many of you know, for nearly 14 years, and then took a new position at the National Institutes of Health last February. So what an exciting and really important way to get reacquainted with not just sociology, but also with SWS. To answer, or to start at least the discussion, I wanted to just say that I was struck by revisiting Pamela Roby's historical account of SWS, and I think a lot of people did that in preparation for this panel and the meeting in general. I did my fair share of historical work while I was at ASA with regard to not just MFP, which a lot of people are familiar with, but sort of the context in which MFP was started. And I think what struck me about Pamela's account was just how much mirroring of the social change happening in society at large was going on. Can everyone hear me okay, Pamela? Okay, thank you, I just wanted to check. The reason I bring this up is because I think talking to a lot of younger scholars over time, I think there's an assumption on their part that ASA was always, sort of progressive with regard to its representation and progressive with regard to inclusion issues and diversity issues. And the fact is, it wasn't always like that. And, in the late 60s and early 70s, again, with the social change happening in the country at large, it was happening at ASA as well. And so the perspective that I'm bringing to you right now is just that ASA had the same issues back when. And so as SWS was being established and then taking off in the early 70s, and I'm sure the others here will recount this better than I, it was just a really poignant and an important moment. And, as far as, my perspective from having been attached to SWS in various ways over my career at ASA, it was just, making sure that the voices were heard. I think that just really struck me, number one. And number two, that SWS always represented a generational passing of the torch of knowledge, of commitment, of the importance of feminist research, as well as support for people in the profession of sociology. So I think I'll stop there with that. I did want to mention, because I think these three themes are going to come out as we talk about this question and others that Adia is going to help navigate. that you are going to see and hear about leadership and how the cross leadership has been so important for both organizations. You know, I can't even begin to do an exhaustive list, but if you look at the SWS elected leadership over time, that's presidents and vice presidents and secretaries and treasurers, you will see a crisscrossing of those, a lot of those people with ASA elected leadership in that same period over the last 50 years. And it's incredible. And just to give a shout out, Mignon may not want me to mention that she's on the ballot for the ASA election coming up this spring for vice president. So, you know, she in many ways is continuing this, you know, tradition. Nancy Lopez, who I know is on, is ASA's current secretary. And, you know, she is obviously just finishing as the SWS vice president. So, you know, all the way back to Alice Rossi and Joan Huber and Arlene Kaplan-Daniels, on through Myra and Kate Burhide, Florence Bonner, Evie Glenn, Barbara, Kathleen Gerson. I mean, you've just got a lot of people that have been, Beth Hess, a lot of people that have been attached to both organizations over time. The last two things too, and I won't go again into this, because again, I think a lot of people are aware, but representations in various facets of the discipline for ASA, this sort of the cross membership being so heavy. You know, you see that over the years with the status committee at ASA for on women and as well as LGBTQ persons in sociology, the sections, sex and gender, race, class, and gender, and of course the Jesse Bernard Award. You know, it's like a who's who of SWS dignitaries if you see the list of winners of that award. And I'd be remiss, of course, by not finishing with the impact that SWS has had on MFP, on the Minority Fellowship Program. You know, I think a lot of people hopefully know that SWS has been a constant, generous partner and donor for the Minority Fellowship Program over time. And, you know, beginning in the mid-2000s, we at ASA named an SWS MFP every year. Well, in 2009, SWS, during the first leadership campaign for MFP that ASA held, contributed the unprecedented generous sum of $100,000 to that campaign, which ended up being about a fifth of the total raised, you know, during that campaign back in 2009. And because of that, that campaign not only reached financial footing that was intended, but it also inspired ASA to name 2 SWS MFPs each year since then. And some of those folks, including Yvonne Sherwood, who we heard from just a little while ago, are here tonight. So I'm sorry for going kind of all over the place there, but I wanted to just start this process off by just stating from my perspective that ASA's impact on the discipline could not have been done, quite frankly, over the last 50 years without SWS's partnership, with SWS's inspiration, and certainly the crisscrossing of members and leaders in our discipline.
Great, thank you, Jean. That was a great way to get us going. What are other thoughts that people have? Barbara?
Yeah, I'm gonna tell a story sort of a little bit further back than Jean went, and that is one of the ways I think we forget how much has changed is that when ASA, when I was an undergraduate and then a graduate student, I was an undergraduate student of Arlene Kaplan-Daniels, so I heard her tell stories. I didn't come to any winter meetings and those really early ones, but I was on the periphery, and ASA used to be, the leadership of ASA used to be all guys. And SWS used to send observers to sit in on the open part of ASA council meetings just to make sure that the guys didn't say really openly sexist things, which, because there would be an SWS observer in the room. So, you know, now when you go to ASA council meetings, the gender distribution is a little bit different. But that was like an ongoing thing. Who's going to be the observer at the council, next council meeting? Because you had to have one SWS person in the room as an observer to keep them in line. Do you want to add something to that? Have you do that, Pam?
If you wouldn't mind my jumping in here, because I
No.
was the one, I was then on the ASA Council as an elected member, you know, because of SWS, and I was feeling very uncomfortable in the meetings, not because so much of sexism, that was just, okay, that was a given. It was that we had very important decisions that I wanted, and sometimes Joan Huber wanted to put forward that had very large implications for women in the profession. And that's why we wanted to have the observers there to see who was voting for those and who wasn't, who was supporting those and who was absolutely pounding against them. Thank you.
No, so I mean, I think SWS was really important there, and that sort of leads to the second thing, which is there's a kind of informal way that SWS was super important at the beginning of its time, and that is to support the sort of mental health and stick-to-itiveness of those first generation of women sociologists who were in a pretty, you know, if they hadn't, research interests were just like everyone else's, they might sort of, you know, maneuver good careers, but if they actually wanted to study something critical or about gender, or even back then just about women, they were really not taken seriously. And so SWS was a place where they met each other and supported each other and created, you know, a kind of legitimation and a sense of this is real and important sociology, which wasn't coming from ASA in the 1970s. And so I think that those are two other ways at the very beginning that the sort of early SWS was seriously important for ASA.
Great. Let's hear from one or two more, only because we have several other questions and I want to make sure that we don't spend the whole time on this one, as interesting as it is. Does anyone else have a thought before we move to the next one? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the second theme, which has to do with the meaning that SWS has for gender scholars and women scholars. And actually, Barbara's comments lead us really well into that discussion. And actually, your comments actually preempt the specific question, which was, what are some of the ways that SWS has impacted the lives and careers of gender scholars and women scholars in the discipline? Barbara has already gotten us talking about that a little bit. So I actually want to pose the follow-up question now and give panelists the choice of answering either. The follow-up question to that asks whether SWS has made space for women's leadership in other spaces, i.e. as department heads, college and university heads, as leaders of other professional organizations within the discipline. And this also touches a little bit on what we've just been discussing. Jean brought up the overlap between SWS leadership and ASA, but I think it's useful for us also to consider what the implications are outside of ASA and perhaps on university settings and in departments as well. What do we think are the meaning, what do we think is the meaning that SWS has had, or the implications that SWS has had for women's leadership, perhaps not just in SWS and in ASA, but in other organizations, in our universities, in our other spaces outside of academia? What implications has SWS had for that? What has SWS done to really contribute to broader feminist leadership at large? So I'd like to start here with Margaret Abraham to give us some thoughts on that one.
Thanks, Mignon and Adia and the wonderful program committee. Before I speak, it's wonderful to be with everyone here tonight and our fellow panelists. You know, Jean has spoken about some of these things. I'd like to bring in the International Sociological Association. I think that we have an incredible panel here who are going to speak about the experience in SWS. But I want to talk a little about the linkages, not only in terms of leadership, but the kind of spaces made. And it's interesting because once again, we see the intersections, right? And so to give a kind of a history, while we're celebrating 50 years of SWS, in 1973, the Research Committee on Women in Society was created, the ISA, was established the ISA, and Pamela Roby, Jesse Bernard, and all of them were also a part of it. So I want to just say that it's interesting in the ways we see the intersections, not of SWS, but also in terms of the leadership. We've had Pat Martin, Esther Naganling Chow, Bandana, and I'm just giving a shout out to a few names because we don't always hear them: Josephine Berkowitz, Akuswa, Melanie Heath, Solange, Roberta, the International Committee. And why am I saying some of these names? Manisha Desai, now Shweta Dur, because SWS and the ISA, the International Sociological Association, and specifically the research committee, Melanie Heath, who is now president of the research committee 32, we have created those spaces where we have, SWS has enabled us to kind of intersect, but we've also seen where issues, not just about gender, but racial justice and borders have come into place. And I think that's important, how those support networks then translate into other spaces. And it's not just making the space, but also sharing the space and collaborating, crossing boundaries. And so to me, as somebody who's had been fortunate to be in both, but had been involved in a leadership role at ISA, it's been incredible to see how this knowledge gets translated in both of those spaces. And we've had, I think one of the things, Sally Hilsman, ASA, ISA, SWS, and just to see a very different model. And I just want to talk a little about that in terms of leadership very quickly. So what were some of the methods? Collaboration, doing programs together, challenging some of the issues of justice, and importantly, research and action, feminist scholars, both in the international sphere doing it. So I think, to me, SWS has been a real collaborative global partner, in the International Committee at SWS has also been engaged in very important ways with leaders in other with ISA. I also want to take a moment to quickly say about departments. I think in this whole panel, we have, and in the audience actually, as I just did a quick run through, we have a huge number of people who have taken a huge shoulder in terms of administration. While we say we want to be at the decision table, it's also meant juggling many things in those leadership roles. And so I think for me, particularly, the fact that we have SWS actually kind of not only at the national or the local and the regional leadership, but we have them also at the international level, and all of them intersect in very important ways so that we can share our knowledge and our support networks. I do want to shout out to the women of color at SWS, at different generations, who have been an incredible support system informally, but then trying to bring about structural change. And we've taken some of those lessons and used it in our institutions to challenge issues such as tenure, promotion, and make social change and bring about a whole new generation looking at a different paradigm in terms of what is the work and the knowledge that matters.
Yeah, that's a great point, Maggie. I was thinking as you were talking that I wonder, I don't know if there's any data to substantiate this, but I wonder if there is a connection between people who have SWS memberships or who are active in the organization, and whether that does lead to some representation in terms of leadership roles in university settings, right? Are you more likely to see representation as department chairs and administrators from people who are sociologists who have a membership in the organization? And perhaps there is that study and I just don't know about it, but I wonder if there is a connection between those things. If there is, I think that's interesting, but I think it also highlights some of the bigger institutional challenges in academia, given that we know that even if my hypothesis is correct and that affiliation with SWS does provide a support structure that leads more women and non-binary people into administrative roles, we still know that overall at the university level, women and non-binary people are underrepresented, particularly at the highest ranks of the university administration, right? So it would be kind of interesting to know if SWS provides some support for giving people the skills and resources and perhaps training that can be beneficial for administrative role, but if that support still butts up against the institutional barriers that make it difficult for women and non-binary people to advance, it's kind of an unfortunate catch-22 in some ways.
Yeah, but it, particularly worth looking into, because I think we've seen every generation some change, but this is a big issue of trans justice as well as racial justice and gender justice, and how this plays out in leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts from any of the other panelists? Veronica, it looks like you would like to comment.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to make sure that my hand is in. Well, thank you so much, first of all, to the program committee, and thank you so much, Mignon, and for the invitation and being in this wonderful panel. I was thinking about, this particular question in terms of how SWS made for women's leadership in how has helping, like other women to be part of other leadership positions. And I think in my my experience for me has been a great opportunity, since it has given me the space to be able to get into leadership positions within SWS, as a student representative. I remember was the first time for me, like getting to know this particular space, like learning to navigate those spaces. They were kind of impossible to think for me to get into those spaces. I think that's, like giving those spaces for students, for grad students, I think it's a great way of a great opportunity for us. I mean, it was in my case, in my very particular circumstances, and that's something that I want to talk about in the next question. So in terms of how I have seen the different changes in the organization, but I wanted to, highlight that, sometimes we think about those particular leadership positions, for example, when we think about presidents, but also I think in our personal lives, giving us the opportunity to feel that we are also capable of, kind of overcoming certain, obstacles, getting into, grad school, for example, and then starting like navigating how to survive the, grad school, and then later, so how we are going to be landing a job. I think in those kind is kind of empowering and help us to build that sort of a confidence. And I think in that sense, for me, at least, it has been a great, sort of a support system that I have been, been able to get to benefit from being part of SWS.
That's a great point, Veronica. Barbara, let's hear from you, and then let's go ahead to the third question.
So I spent some time thinking about the past. So for tonight, because 50 years, and I'm not the only one, but I'm one of the oldest who might remember that really. And I just wanted to say, in terms of affecting other organizations and leadership, if my memory of the first 10 years of what was then called winter meetings was most of them were spent arguing or debating who to support or endorse for ASA elections. And then we were really good at voting as a block, so that basically our endorsement at some point meant this person got elected. And that was a real way. First it was, first I remember it was mostly choosing between the least worst guy, that was, which one was least terrible. But then of course it wasn't just not, and then there was some progressive, and then there were women running, and then there were lots of arguments about, here you had two different people running and you had lots of people on either side, at which point I think the organization kind of decided we weren't going to do endorsements anymore, because it wasn't sort of one fascist running against somebody who was open to feminist principles, but it was more complicated than that. But those early days, it really changed ASA, because in endorsement from SWS, people resented it. It was like, oh, those women control everything because they voted the block, but it made a difference. And then of course we don't do that anymore. But I think that's a kind of, and the same thing happened in Southerns, There was a time when I first started going to Southerns, it was not really a very friendly place for women, and certainly not for feminists. But then SWS South sort of, who should we run and who should we suggest should run? What awards do we need? Who should be on the committees? And eventually SWS South kind of took over Southerns. So I think that, I don't know about other, regionals, but there was a way in which SWS, the collective organization of, made a difference in changing the leadership.
Great, thanks, Barbara. Let's move to the third theme. This one I think is going to be a doozy. Mignon has put forth a question that I think is really going to elicit a lot of conversation. This third theme asks us to think about changes in the growth and development of SWS. So the specific question is, how has SWS as an organization changed over time? What are some of the pivots that had to be made in the growth of SWS as an organization, and were they successful? So examples of this include the development of a journal, the need for sister-to-sister, changes in structure, such as the addition of graduate students to council, and greater emphasis on international feminist scholars and scholarship. So again, there's a lot there to think about, given we're talking about a 50-year period and a lot has changed over a long period of time. So let's start with Pamela Roby. And here I do want to ask some specific people for comments. I want to start with Pamela Roby and hear her thoughts. But then I'd like to move to Veronica Montes to talk about the experiences of women of color, and go to Barbara to talk about the founding of Sister to Sister. So Pamela, let's start with you.
Thank you, Adia. And Mignon, thank you so much for organizing this very special panel. I applaud what each of you and your cohorts have accomplished through your SWS leadership. In order to give a sense of how SWS came to be and how it changed during its early years, I'd like to go back to 1969. I was beginning my 5th year as a sociology graduate student at NYU. In September, I participated in the Women's Sociology Caucus held at Glide Memorial Church during the ASA meetings in San Francisco. We met at Glide because the ASA did not allow us to meet in its hotel, the San Francisco Hilton. Our senior colleagues, Gertrude Selznick and Alice Rossi, began by telling us personal stories about their experience as women and wives in the profession. At the time, there had been 9 and 12 years, respectively, since they had completed their PhDs. While both had published and had worked continuously as researchers and lecturers, neither had held a tenure-track position. The over 200 of us in the caucus room soon moved on to our major action. This was finalizing and approving the Women's Caucus statement and resolutions that we planned to present to the ASA. The next day, September 3rd, 1969, Alice Rossi presented them to the ASA's general business meeting. Because this statement and these resolutions are benchmarks for what those of us in SWS did later, and indeed everything that has followed, I want to read 2 paragraphs from them. I quote, "We have already gathered the empirical facts concerning the distribution of women amongst students and faculty of graduate sociology departments," end quote. Actually, it was Alice Rossi who, without funding, had done a survey of sociology graduate departments with a 79% response rate. Our resolution continued. "What we seek is effective and dramatic action and an unbiased policy in the selection of stipend support of students, a concerted commitment to the hiring and promotion of women sociologists to right the imbalance that is represented in the current situation in which 67% of the women sociology graduate students in this country do not have a single woman sociology professor of senior rank during the course of their graduate training. And when we participate in an association of sociologists in which no woman will sit on the 1970 council, no woman is included among the associate editors of the American Sociological Review or the advisory board of the American Journal of Sociology, and no woman sits on the committees on nominations and publications, each of which have 13 members. We urge that every sociology department give priority to the hiring and promotion of women faculty until the proportion and rank distribution of women faculty at least equals the sex ratio among graduate students, with a long-range goal of increasing the proportion of women among graduate students. Working toward this goal must supplement rather than detract from department efforts to train, hire, and promote personnel and students of color, end quote. Before Alice Rossi read our statement and resolutions to the ASA business meeting, those of us who participated in the caucus scattered ourselves in twos and threes around the Hilton Ballroom. We were prepared to stare down anyone who spoke against our resolutions, but we did not need to. Someone quickly called the question. 2 ASA members voted against the motion and over 600 voted for it. Shortly afterwards, the ASA Council unanimously approved the motion. The Council also urged all sociology departments to study the resolutions. Furthermore, the Council voted to publish the resolutions along with the Women's Caucus statement as part of the convention proceedings in the American Sociologist. A year and a half later, on the weekend of February 12th to 14th, 1971, almost 50 years ago, many of us who were at the caucus met again. This time we did so in the ASA office in Washington, D.C., where others joined us. We were meeting to create a new organization, an organization that was independent of the ASA. After much debate, we very deliberately decided to call ourselves Sociologists for Women in Society. This name reflected our intention to include all feminist sociologists, men as well as women, and to include the liberation of all women rather than only the liberation of women in sociology. In that one winter 1971 weekend meeting, thanks largely to Alice Rossi's circulating model bylaws during the fall, 20 SWS members finalized bylaws and selected acting officers in an effort to solidify the new organization into one that might have ongoing effectiveness. Before we departed, we enthusiastically chose, and Alice Rossi agreed to serve as SWS's first acting president. Many, perhaps most, of the women who participated in those early years of SWS have now passed away. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. That was just great history and broader context to think about and reflect on. Veronica, you're up next, and I think this will be interesting to pick up from where Pam left off. Pamela's given us some really great things to think about in terms of the history of how SWS started and what that environment and what that climate was like. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about your experiences in the present, particularly about your experience, particularly as a woman of color in the organization. We all know that's been sometimes a challenging thing that the organization has had to wrestle with and to deal with. Can you tell us more about your experiences as a woman of color in the organization years later, and how you think the organization has progressed, what your experiences have been like, whatever you'd like to share on that front?
Thank you, Adia. Yes, thank you so much, Pamela. I think it's such a beautiful way to kind of start like reflecting in this long history, and especially because it's important also see, how much we have, like move forward. And I think in that sense, when you were describing, like crafting that particular space for, like for feminists, for women, but I was thinking in terms of, what that represents for women of color. So I'm gonna read what I wrote this afternoon, because I was reflecting about this and I wanted to focus on what I wrote. Being here among past presidents, past gender society editors and esteemed scholars would be unthinkable 50 years ago for someone like me, who is not only a woman of color, but also a Mexican immigrant woman for whom English is her second language. With a working class background and with parents for whom access to education was denied. They just got a few years of elementary school. In that context, I can certainly say that as an organization, SWS has definitely changed over the years since SWS has crafted a space for people like me to be able to be here tonight in this panel. Having said that, I wanted to focus on 3 specific ways in which I see how the structure of SWS has changed. First, in the socio-demographic composition of SWS leadership. I have been serving SWS since 2012 in different capacities. First, as a student representative for 2 years, which allowed me to join the council, and again in 2018 as a treasurer. These 2 positions gave me the opportunity to work with different presidents, vice presidents, and other council members. As a student representative, I worked closely with Vandana Purkanashta as president and also with Tiffany Taylor as vice president. And as a treasurer, I have been working closely with Josephine Botil-Betts as president and Nancy Lopez as vice president. I remember my first time sitting in that council meeting in 2012, where I literally felt I just wanted to run away, as many times I have felt. Because at that time I felt out of place since I was among the very few people of color in that table. It was only Vandana and Manisha that were in the table and who were there. And they were the ones for whom I felt that I was able to stay there, basically. I was the only person of color at that time. And since I was still grad student, so it was the first time for me sitting in such a space. So it was very difficult. I felt very uncomfortable, as only people belonging to minorities can feel by occupying those particular spaces of power. Fast forward, in our last winter meeting in San Diego last year, it was in our council meeting where we were, out of the 12 people that were sitting in that council, 8 people were people of color. And the other 2 white people who were there, so were queer and a non-binary gender individual. So that's just to give you a sense of how much it has changed in terms for me in only 10 years, seeing, like the number, the representation in the people in the leadership positions at SWS. The second change that I have seen over the years, it has been, particularly when we are talking about the organizational structure of SWS. So particularly with the hiring of Barrett Katuna as executive officer, it has been a crucial, change in the whole way in which SWS operated before. So Barrett has not only, helped us to improve the structure of the organization, but I think more importantly, has helped us to focus mainly in the quality of the way in which SWS has been, serving to its members. It has been a significant change. Last but definitely not least, over the years, one of the most significant changes for me at least, it has been seeing the increase, although still low, in terms of the members from different ethnicities, gender identities, nationalities, and ways of being a feminist. Which has allowed for many of us to create a sense of community and a sense of belonging to this organization, which unfortunately many times it haven't been the case, we're feeling so alienated. But in that regards, I wanted to acknowledge all the work that the first members of color in this organization had done in terms of to pave the road to make possible that today people like me can be in these spaces. I wanted to acknowledge, for example, the work of Esther Nan Lin Chong, Vandana Pratanaska, Manisha Desai, Josephine Good Pets, Margaret Abraham, Mario Sirin, and many others that unfortunately I can't name, or I can't remember the names right now, but I just want to say that is because of those women, you know, that every time, so many times we were keep asking people, women of color, we keep asking why we are returning every single winter meeting to SWS, which sometimes is not a very friendly space for people like us, is because we wanted to see those faces of those very few women who always making us feel at home, who always says they are there and they are like creating the space for us to feel more well received, well welcoming. Thank you.
Great comments, Veronica. And I just want to touch on something that you said to shout out Barrett. I had the pleasure of working with her when I was, I think Barrett's first year as executive officer might have been my year as president-elect. She might remember exactly, I don't. But I just really appreciated the opportunity to work closely with her and to observe just what an excellent job she has done and continues to do, and the enormous amount of effort and work that Barrett tirelessly puts into this organization. It's inspiring. Barbara, I don't want to cut short your time, but I do want to hear from you about Sister to Sister and some of your work involved in, your reflections and work involved in getting that going. I just want to make sure that we stay on track. We've still got 3 more themes and questions, and I want to make sure that we have time for others who are on the call to join in and share thoughts also. So just a reminder, but definitely I want to hear your thoughts and reflections about Sister to Sister and getting that started and how that reflects what we've been talking about in terms of how the organization has changed.
Oh, sure, and I'll be brief. When I became president in 2003, there were a lot of jokes about SWS in the profession. It was kind of a time where I cannot tell you how many male sociologists came up to me and ribbed me that I was taking over an organization that was mostly primarily white, menopausal, second wave feminists. I mean, there was like, it was really quite, it was really this, I'm not making this up. This really, people were making these kind of jokes, and they were wrong, of course, but they weren't entirely wrong, because we were an organization that was still primarily overrepresenting people like me, right? Who weren't necessarily at the very beginning, but were near the beginning. And so I wanted to do something that sort of I wanted to do something that would sort of reinvigorate. And it was clear when we were not the place that was of choice for women of color. We also didn't at that moment have a whole lot of really junior people either. And I had a presidential aide who's now a professor at Florida State University, Patricia Warren, and together we sort of, we knew that I was something that I couldn't do for her, which is that I try to be a good mentor, but I couldn't help her figure out how to be a faculty member of color in a place where she was the only woman or of color or even person of color in the department. I could want to help, but I couldn't help because I didn't know how. And so we started together, Sister to Sister, and it was really at the beginning, really a mentorship, part of the mentorship committee, or asked next to it, adjacent, and it was to put together younger women of color with more senior women of color who weren't necessarily in their own universities or departments, because there weren't any, there weren't a lot. And so that they could have a kind of mentorship relationship with people who had the kinds of jobs they were seeking. And that was really how Sister to Sister began. It wasn't the big, wonderful project that other people have made it, but it started out as a way to try to bring particularly young women of color into the organization by providing them something they needed, which were mentorship and relationships with people they couldn't have met otherwise if we couldn't, find who they were and then say, will you mentor this person? And so that's sort of just the history of how Sister to Sister started.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, Mignon asked me to comment about my own experiences, but I want to make sure we stay on track. But if I have time to later, I'd like to say a little bit more about that being a factor in why I accepted the nomination to run for office myself, because I felt really strongly about some of the same issues that Barbara has raised. So Dana, you're not off the hook. We haven't forgotten about you. The next theme focuses on gender in society and the study of gender in sociology. And I want to start with you to get some of your thoughts about gender in society at large. As one of the editors of the journal and someone who's really had a significant impact on shaping it and the kind of scholarship that went out in sociology, can we talk about the significance of gender in society to the discipline in terms of the type of scholarship that it publishes and to the careers of scholars who study gender in its various forms? And just as a personal side note, I have my own experiences with Dana as an editor. I remember working on a piece a long time ago about Black men in nursing that I sent to Dana based on her interest in the piece when I told her that I was working on it. And she told me that she wanted to see it. She was such an incredible editor, gave me a I can't even tell you all how much work that piece needed when I first sent it to Dana. But she was tireless and generous and so thoughtful in giving me incredible editorial guidance. It ended up being published in the paper, and it's one of the works that I'm really proud of. And I know that it got that way because Dana was just an incredible visionary in terms of her views about how to put together an article that was a lot better than it was when she first took a look at it. So, so Dana, what are some of your thoughts about this? Can you tell us about the significance of the...
Yeah, that's very, very kind of you. And I will say that editing Gender in Society is the most satisfying thing I've done in my career. It really is. It's the most amazing thing to be able to work with papers and shape them from the beginning, and to have a vision for those papers and to see authors come through and realize them. I don't think people were always all that excited about all the comments I sent them, but I put myself in a lake because this is where my family has a house on Lake Texoma, and I hope to be able to see them again before the year is out. So just as a reminder. So, well, I've been asked to talk about the history of and impact of gender in society, and I'll do that, but I also want to ask some questions that I think the organization needs to consider. So I think by now we all probably know the story of the founding of the journal, though we certainly need to write it down. Which grew out of the neglect of scholarship on women and gender and women scholars themselves by mainstream sociology. Because I can't talk without data, I went back to 1987, which doesn't feel that long ago to me, but was the first year that Gender in Society was published, to look at what was being published in mainstream sociology. I looked at all the articles published by AJS and ASR in 1987. They published 99 articles that year. Of those, 20% had any women authors, and only 14% of them were about gender at all. So there's an organizational story to be told here, and I think it's a struggle that really hasn't gone away. Of the founding mothers, many of whom are here, and so I won't speak for them because I know they can speak for themselves, but many, and I know Pat Martin was among them, were opposed to the founding of the journal. In part, they saw the founding of the journal as a distraction from the key feminist work of political change and as an elitist enterprise in contradiction to the more egalitarian goals and orientation of SWS. Many had little desire to reproduce the typical academic structure of elitism. And of those critics, some used a phrase I heard many, many times during my editorship. They were worried that the journal, the tail, would come to wag the dog. Yet others believe strongly in the need for an outlet for feminist work and feminist scholars. And so a kitchen table meeting was convened, of course, around Beth Hess's kitchen table. I've heard about it many times. And plans were made and a contract was secured, and Gender in Society's first issue was published in 1987. The mission statement of the journal remains the same, and the original model, unlike other journals, was that reviews were to be developmental and mentoring. Every submission was to receive an outside review by 3 reviewers. It was during that first year that, of course, Judith Lorber published Doing Gender. The story of that paper is in the symposium we published during my editorship, and as you know, it's now become probably the most cited article in the history of gender studies, the field of gender studies. So Gender in Society has unquestionably provided a home for the best in gender scholarship. I haven't counted the authors themselves, but I guess 90% or more have been women. At the same time, it's opened doors for women across sociology. I was running out of time, but I did manage to look up the output of articles for ASR in 2020. 27% had women authors, any women authors. That's not great. It's up from 20% though. Of those, 88% were first authors, and 37% of the articles in 2020 focused on, in some way, on gender. So up from 14% in 1987. Now that's a double-edged sword. It means that the growing legitimacy of gender scholarship in mainstream sociology means that Gender and Society has missed some of those articles it might have gotten in the early days. And I can promise you there have been some published in ASR that I wish I had had. Yet at the same time, my hope is that at least some of those scholars realize the kinds of doors that Gender and Society opened for them. So GNS is unquestionably a scholarly and commercial success. I served as an editor during the first year of the lucrative SAGE contracts, which funded the work of editing the journal. My office was funded. I could find deputy editors for the first time. I think Barrett was funded through Bondina. So we were able to sort of spread the money around in ways that I thought were consistent with SWS's mission, and SWS knows how much money it's put in its own treasury. Gendered Society has been in existence and has been an option for my work since the year I started graduate school in 1987. I wasn't at that kitchen table because I would have been a little young, but I think that helped shape my view of the journal as an institution rather than as a revolution. So during those years, we brought the journal online, submissions quadrupled. In the process, we started to get a lot of submissions that were wildly inappropriate. So I want you to think menstruation and bears. Like not like, I'm talking about bears that dwell in the forest, not like hairy human bears, right? I mean, papers on women menstruating and the danger that bears posed when they were camping. We would get papers like that. Our acceptance rate plunged, our desk reject rate rose, right? Which is the number of papers that we rejected without submission. The original goal that every manuscript would receive a review was no longer realistic. For manuscripts that just needed too much development, I tried to write substantive letters that I hoped would turn the papers in the right direction. Nobody ever got a one sentence, sorry, your paper sucks, go away, right? This decision, however, created no small amount of controversy, particularly among the founding mothers, though I saw it as the only one possible under the circumstances. I also wanted to honor the unpaid labor of our reviewers, who are often junior people who themselves, right, who are doing their own labor to support the discipline. Senior people, though we ask them a lot, rarely do reviews. They're very nice people, but they don't review a lot. At the same time, our impact factor began to rise, at least in part, I think, because I made that a priority. We published a lot of young authors, but at the same time, we did invited symposia in which senior scholars wrote invited pieces that were highly cited. Senior, very famous gender scholars will rarely just send you a paper over the transom. In fact, that never happens, and they don't often review, but they will often write something if asked. I will say that they vary markedly in their brevity and their enthusiasm for being edited, however, and I won't name any names. But this focus on the impact factor was another shift away from the original ideological mission of the founders, and one that I understood was a trade-off. Still, I strongly believe that making Gender and Society more conventionally reputable was a service to those feminist scholars whose colleagues devalued their work because it appeared in low-impact journals. When Gender and Society was ranked far above those conventionally reputable journals, there was no place for those critics to stand. And I got a lot of letters from people who said, you know what, my male colleagues are madly in love with whatever, and Gender and Society is ranked 5 places above it, right? So I got some joy out of that. We renewed another lucrative contract with SAGE. ASA, people at ASA will tell you that missing out on Gender and Society was one of the stupidest decisions they ever made. ASA editors are universally starved. All these changes meant that my term was not without controversy, and many of my friends who are on this call have heard about this in more detail than I'm sure they ever wanted. Subsequent editors, as Barbara will probably attest, have continued to deal with the challenges of increasing numbers of submissions and organizational pressures that also come with editing a society journal under the auspices of feminist organizations. So I just want to leave you with a question. I think Gender and Society has opened doors, built careers, and given legitimacy to an entire field in sociology or subfield. But the fact that it has done so has come as the result of many intentional choices and of the professionalization of that original kitchen table enterprise. So these are the kinds of questions I think we might think about. What does it mean for SWS to operate one of the most commercially successful journals in the discipline? What does it mean that Gender and Society is now exactly the kind of professional gatekeeper that many of the founding mothers rejected? Is it possible for the broader goals of SWS to be realized through the journal? Has the journal become the tail that wags the dog? Is it the cash cow mooing in a field? Is there any other farm-based metaphor I can do? What does SWS want the journal to be? And how are those choices constrained by financial and career realities? I think now, maybe 35 years on, it's time that we return to that kitchen table and think about those issues.
These are amazing questions, Dana. Thank you so much for that retrospective and for giving us some food for thought. Barbara, I want to hear from you. You are the current editor. There have been editors in between you and Dana, but you are the current editor, obviously, and have some current thoughts about it. But I want us all to keep in mind the questions that Dana has raised also. I'm going to make sure that we have some time for discussion and conversation after the questions conclude, which is, like I said, partly why I've been rushing people a little bit to make sure that answers have some brevity. But I'd like to hear Barbara's thoughts about how Dana's reflections relate to or are similar or dissimilar to her experiences currently as the editor. And I'd like for us all to be thinking about the questions that Dana has raised so that perhaps we can discuss them when there's time at the end.
Thank you, Dana. That was really interesting. Lots about the history. By the time I inherited this journal last year, it was running pretty much like any other social science journal in the profession. Our desk reject rates are quite high, about 50%. We couldn't possibly review everything that came in. Last year we had over 700 manuscripts come in, 136 more than the year before. So you can see and then part of that is because we are becoming more of a journal that people send articles to from all over the world. And so the more you become visible in the whole world, the more articles you get, and so in many ways, I think that the questions Dana raised are really important, and that the journal is really different than it is now, a kind of the leading journal. It actually is the most cited journal, except for gender work and organizations is more cited than, I always knew that it was the second. I always had presumed science was more, but actually it's gender work and organization that is more cited. But so it is a journal that runs very much like any other, except perhaps that our goal and our instructions to reviewers remain sort of mentorship, develop, help, even if we're going to not publish it, let's help develop this into a better piece of research. I would like to think that we're not the only journal that feels that way, but maybe we are. I hope not. But I think that what we've done in some ways, when I inherited a super well-run, oiled machine, but I think what the former editors have done is help create gender scholarship as very legitimate in the field. With a journal this highly cited, nobody, department head or dean, can say, that's not important stuff. Nobody cares about that. We're not going to tenure you, right? So that there's a way in which becoming legitimate actually helps our authors. And yet, in the same way, being legitimate, perhaps, as Dana says, makes us more elitist and more about gatekeeping and not in the spirit of their founding mothers. And so I don't have an answer to that, but I do think that the fact that we are considered legitimate and high quality does continue to help the careers of people, of feminist sociologists, and even people who don't publish in the journal. So that's it.
Excellent. Maggie, you want to make a quick comment before we move?
I just, thank you, Adia. I just want to add, because that I have to say, there were quite a lot of lessons learned from the journal. I also want to kind of shout out to Vandana, who was deputy editor during Dana's time and when I was on the board, that what was impressive and actually was used by other journals is the way the review process, in terms of the way it was done in a very, there was criticism, but constructive. And Adia, you bring it up, in how this is brought. And I think that's a good model to think about. How you don't just give comments, but also solutions of how, to resolve some of the problems. And the letter that used to come from Dana and Vandana, who had also put in a lot of time. And I also want to add the international component, trying to broaden who the contributors was an important part of another shift in terms of gender and society. And I think that's an important one, especially as we think of linkages beyond the borders of SWS nationally.
Thank you, Maggie. Great points. So I want to turn a little more personal to some degree. Mignon has asked us to think about panelists' personal reflections and recollections of special moments in SWS. So conferences, receptions, social networking. So I'd like to start here with Pamela and then get some comments from her about some of your personal recollections about SWS. Any special moments that you recall during conferences, receptions, and then if there's anyone who would like to make one more comment after Pamela, then we'll have time for one more comment from her after that. But I want to get a sense from people about their personal thoughts. When you think about the history of SWS, when you think about personal moments that meant a lot to you at conferences or meetings or whatever, what are some things that really stand out to you and just, give you a warm spot?
Thank you, Adia. I'd like to share a personal recollection about SWS that preceded our conferences. Very early in the winter of 1971, when I was 28, finishing the last chapter of my sociology dissertation and teaching for the first time at George Washington University, Jessie Bernard telephoned me. I had met Jessie, who was then 67, at meetings of the Society for the Study of Social Problems and the DC Sociological Association. I'd found this brilliant woman, warm, friendly, and motherly. Jessie invited me and Dawn Day, who was also completing her dissertation and teaching part-time at the University of Maryland, to join her and Arlene Daniels for lunch in her apartment in Washington, D.C. Arlene, who is an assistant professor of sociology at San Francisco State, had decided to visit Jessie for a few days on her way home after they'd met during a small 1971 SWS organizing meeting at Yale. Both Jessie and Arlene bubbled with excitement about the meeting, while I had felt excited and hopeful during the 1969 Women's Sociology Caucus in San Francisco. In Jessie's home, I not only felt excited and hopeful, but that I was in the midst of an intimate, friendly, supportive group of women colleagues. With Jessie's encouragement, in the spring of 1971, Dawn, whom SWS elected a year later as its first national treasurer, and I organized the first meeting of the Washington, D.C. chapter of SWS. While we were having our first D.C. SWS meeting, others were organizing SWS chapters elsewhere around the United States. These actions were among the earliest pivots in the founding and growth of our organization. It's from such small beginnings that you and others in SWS have transformed and are continuing to transform our profession, which 50 years ago had a council composed solely of men. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela, for that. Barbara, you're in my notes to call on next, but I don't want to overdo it because I know I've asked you for a lot of a lot of commentary of late. Anyone else on the panel? I mean, feel free to jump in if you want to, Barbara, but don't feel obligated. Is there anyone on the panel who has a special moment or a reflection of SWS that they'd like to share? Anything that just stands out as a particularly special memory? Veronica?
Yeah, very quickly, I wanted to share something. It was in 2013, after coming back from the meeting in New Mexico, and I think it was under Bandana. As a person who had migrated, you know, the search for home is always part of my life. It has been part of my life. Every time when I had the opportunity to go back to Mexico, every time when I coming back to the United States, it's always that sense of like crying, right? Feeling like I am leaving home again. So I remember that particular year, 2013, because when I was coming back from that meeting, I was landing in Los Angeles. And for the first time, I felt after 25 years that I was basically landing in my home. And the reason why, you know, I was thinking about why after 25 years was the first time for me feeling that I was landing at home. It was because I was spending 3 days in, you know, among friends, colleagues in SWS. For me, SWS became my place where I felt again, after so many years, I felt again to be part of a community. It's a place where I feel that every time when I go in the winter meeting particularly, I see people who I can say that they are my friends, where I can feel like very happy, you know, like I look forward for those moments. And I think that's for me why SWS is very, very, you know, like it's part of who I am. And I very, very kind of grateful for that space. Yes.
Thanks, Veronica. Jean, I think you had a quick comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I did, just quickly, because I think people will remember different winter meetings. I actually haven't been to very many because of different competing priorities around January, February. But one I did go to was in 2007, and it was at New Orleans. Do people remember that? It was one where SWS had actually made a commitment to hold their meeting there partially to help support the city after Hurricane Katrina. And so I remember going to that, and the best memory I have actually was the banquet, which was held at the Palace Cafe, which I think a lot of people remember, because I think back when we were all meeting in cities, that was a popular spot. The thing that strikes me was that I'd also just begun working at ASA about a year in. And so our good friend, colleague, and in my sense, a mentor, Carla Howry, was also on staff at ASA at the time. And she would tell me these stories of what would happen at the banquet, where the mic would get passed around and people would say, everything from personal circumstances, family, milestones and things, but of course, professional milestones too. People who got tenure, had a book published, and obviously that tradition has continued. But that was my first time seeing that. And Carla, of course, had the historical role to that point of emceeing that process at many meetings. And so she's like, you're not going to believe what you see, but this is what we do. And it's so powerful and so inspirational and so supportive of everyone there, especially the junior scholars and the students. And sure enough, that was absolutely the case. And I know that mantle's been passed down to Tracy Orr and perhaps others along the way. But anyway, just that's a memory I'll always remember.
That's a great one. Thank you, Jean, for sharing that. So it's Central Time, it's 8:30. We have until 9:15 my time, 10:15 your time. I'm determined to make sure that we have at least a half hour for discussion. So we are well on track. And because we're so on track, I actually want to hear from everybody on this final question. I want to hear from everybody on the panel on this last one, which has to do with the next 50 years of SWS. So when we think about the future, it's been 50 years, there'll be many more years of SWS going forward. What do you think the next 50 years holds for SWS? And here we can think about feminist politics, intersectional feminism, study of gender and gender non-binaries, the role of gender and women's leadership within the discipline, growth and change in the structure of SWS, or anything else. But I really want all of us to weigh in for the next 15 minutes about what we see for the future of this organization that has had such an impact and meant so much to all of us. So I'd like to start with Veronica, and then we can just contribute however we see fit on this question. And once we're done, then I want to turn it over to everybody to get more of a conversation and dialogue going from all of those who are attending, so that we don't have to put it all in the chat.
Yeah.
Veronica, could you start us off? What do you see
Yeah.
for the future of the organization?
Thank you, Adia. I think it's very symbolic to be the first responder to this question. I said this because of what my identity represents. So to reiterate once again, you know, like being immigrant, woman of color, first generation of traditional student, and also coming to this country without documents. So I crossed the border. So many years ago. Anyways, asking this question to someone like me who has been in the margins, not only in this society, but also in the academia, I see it as an invitation to think from the margins and bring that perspective to the center. I think this is very important to see that. Having said that, so I just wanted to, I had a list, but I just wanted to focus on two aspects that I want us to think about it. I would like to see more transnational feminism, collaborations with different geographical regions. In that sense, I think SWS has a lot of potential in terms of the kind of members it has. We have members who continue working on and collaborating with their countries of origin. We have members from India, from Sierra Leone, from different countries from Latin America, such as Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Central America, and so on. And in each of those regions over the last decades, there have been so many changes that the feminists in those countries have been the protagonist. For example, in Argentina last December, so the abortion law was passed, you know, in what was with a lot of support, what is called the Marea Verde, the green tide, you know, which contributed significantly to the pass of this law. I think that it is time for us in SWS to look seriously at the South, the global South, and be open to learn from other ways of being also feminist. I think there is so much that we can learn. We have been talking about this for so long. I think I have been here for 10 years, but I think that's a very important moment right now that we can take advantage. I think we can learn from each other. So what is happening in these other regions? And I think right now, after all these years, SWS has accumulated a lot of capital with, you know, like because of the members that they have. Also, I would like to see a conversation about what our role as feminist organization is to contribute to dismantle this white supremacy systematic structure so embedded in this country. This is a historical moment that I think we need to be really thinking about how we as an organizations, we can contribute to do this, you know, like going to that sort of a, you know, like path. This is a long-term project that will require us to begin reflecting on how, as organization, SWS has reproduced and keep reproducing that kind of oppressive system. I think that's very important for us to start thinking about that. Last but not least, I would like to see more intergenerational collaboration where the young generations can learn from the experience and wisdom of those who have paved the road for us, and where the old generation can also continue learning from the new challenges and strategies that the younger generation endure today.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica. Quick thoughts from others. Where do we see the organization going in 50 years?
Oh, I don't have a clue about where we see the organization going in 50 years, but I will say what I think is one of the challenges that is in some ways produced by our success, which is to say, I mean, you've mentioned the linkage between SWS leadership and being leadership on our campuses or in other kinds of spaces. And I think that leaves us with the challenge of what is feminist organizational change, right? So once we get into those spaces, what does it mean to start to transform those institutional structures in ways that really produce equity? You know, I've been involved with the advanced program. A lot of people, the National Science Foundation's advanced program, a lot of people on this call have been. And it was I spent a year as a rotator at NSF, and it was amazing to be able to have those conversations about, we don't want to fix women. There's nothing wrong with women, right? What we want to do is change organizations in a way that creates equity. And I think, as we have now come closer to grasping those levers of change, the question is, what do we do with them, right? And how does a feminist analysis inform how we can change organizations to create equity rather than just sort of reproducing those structures that were there before? I mean, in some ways, it's a question that goes to Cantor, for God's sakes. I mean, it's a question that we've been asking for a very long time, but we are closer now to the levers of making that happen, it seems to me, than we had been before. And I think we still don't know, in some ways, how to create equity in organizations, in organizational structures. So I see that, to me, as one of the most important questions that we have to answer. So what can we take from here and go and move in that direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maggie, someone noted in the chat that you've got experience with ISA, and Dana's brought up this question of thinking about other organizations. Would you care to reflect a little bit on your thoughts about going forward from either perspective?
Thank you, Vandana, for asking that question. I want to say something, as we celebrate 50 years, that we have to also acknowledge some of the challenges we face. And one is, we think of the next, as to your question, to the future. Veronica mentioned some key points, but I also think we have to think of what we learned from other organizations and what we understand from international, from other countries, and the kinds of mobilization and fights, struggles for social justice. I mean, we talk a lot about the linkages between research and activism, right? And the nature of journals, etc. I think during my travels as ISA president, one of the things that often came up was that we don't kind of emulate the same models, right? The same models that we have critiqued, and then go and show that same kind of hegemony when we talk to other organizations and under other countries. So what is the nature of this global collaboration? What is the nature of global partnership? And what do we have that we can actually get from these other spaces? And to me, the future of SWS to a large extent is that we have to change in this global economy. I use the term, contextual globalization, so that you have a global community, but you also have to understand the context, right? So our journals and who we incorporate, who we partner with, how we move from the rhetoric to the reality will be huge in terms of not reproducing some of the same things that SWS has challenged with ASA and other organizations. How do we move forward and begin reflecting on what lessons we can learn from the global realm and from the global south that has been very involved in many of these kind of actions of research, linking research and action in meaningful ways to advocate for social change and equity.
Great, thanks a lot, Maggie. Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Well, for me, SWS has sort of been my professional home. I love it. And I think we've done a tremendous amount of work that's great. I do think there's lots of ways in which we still have more to do. And I think for me, it seems like trying to really highlight the four in sociology, for women in society, is really useful for the next 50 years. I think we've been very successful in many ways in terms of when we hear Pamela's memories about, 50 years ago. We don't live in that world anymore, and that's a really wonderful thing, and SWS has been part of that. But I don't think we've been as successful or as effective in figuring out how to use the power that we have, and then actually the economic, we're one of the few social justice organizations I'm a part of that actually isn't broke all the time, that has financial resources to do things that are about sociologists for women in society and for social justice. I think that putting some of our resources more towards public sociology, towards supporting the way in which sociology as a discipline can be useful in social justice arenas. I think, to me, now that we've made so many successes, and that it's time to really focus, and I hope for the next, it's sort of in that word for, and for women and for social justice. And because I don't think we've been as successful there as we have been in other ways. So
Great.
that's my hope.
Thank you, Barbara. Jean, you also, like Maggie, have experience that spans multiple organizations. Could you give us some reflections based on how you see both of those bridging these connections from ASA, NIH, SWS? What are your thoughts about where the organization's future lies?
Thank you for the question, Adia. Well, I'm biased because SWS has been so instrumental in supporting the Minority Fellowship Program, which is something I referred to early on when I spoke. I'd be remiss actually, because I'm seeing Myra and Dawn right on my screen, but not recognizing that Myra was so central in garnering that significant $100,000 support back in 2009 for SWS to really solidify MFP's financial footing at the time. And I mention this because I think SWS has done a wonderful job in supporting the transitions in the pathways in higher education, especially from graduate school to early faculty, and then early faculty into senior positions. One thing that I would sort of openly ask folks to consider is what else SWS could do with its networks and resources to reach those pathways younger, stage-wise than graduate school or that dissertation late grad school stage. The reason I say this is because, as many of you know, I also work in student affairs programming at ASA. And so, getting undergrads interested in grad school and getting those folks who are interested in gender studies or feminist research or things that SWS members have such expertise in, as well as this motivation, right, to be involved in an organization that just is so supportive and is so organized and well-resourced and is forward-thinking. Getting folks at an earlier stage and capturing them, I think you're looking at the future generation of SWS members down the road. So that's something that's just comes out naturally in terms of what I'm thinking. And Pamela might have a response, so I'll turn things over to her.
If somebody has a direct response, please go first, because mine.
Oh, Manisha, I see in the chat.
Grow out of
Okay,
that.
okay,
To
wasn't
one
even looking
extent.
at that.
Yeah, I want to leave comments from participants at the end, but actually, Pamela, I wanted to give you the last word as the person with the most extensive memory here. So I want to make a quick comment so that you can be the person who we hear from last, so that we can honor your important contributions to the organization. But I just want to say, when I think about where the organization goes in 50 years, I think about what I mentioned before in terms of what motivated me to want to be more involved and to take on a leadership role in the organization. And it actually was sparked by conversations that I had with people who were not SWS members, particularly women of color who were graduate students and new assistant professors. And I noticed when I would do campus visits to places that when I would talk with particularly Black women in sociology, they would talk about feeling so isolated and so alone and so adrift in this field. And it was upsetting for a lot of reasons, but it also really pissed me off that 20 years after being a graduate student myself, people were still experiencing the same feelings that I experienced as a student, of also feeling so isolated and so adrift and feeling as though there just was not support and that there was not an infrastructure in place that understood or could speak to or offer an environment that reflected your needs and your experiences, particularly as a woman of color. And I found that so wrong and so unfortunate that there would still be, years after, again, my own experience as a graduate student, these waves of successive women of color coming up still experiencing the same thing. So for me, it was really important to be more involved in SWS, to try to do what I could to make the organization a space that would be available for women of color who, like myself, may not have known about it as graduate students, or may have felt for whatever reason that it wasn't a place that included or welcomed them. But it felt really necessary and critical to try to be involved in trying to transform the perceptions and the experiences that people had in the space to make it a place that they could feel comfortable also, and that they could feel would not be as alienating and hostile as academia often can feel. So my term as president was 2 or 3 years ago, I think. So it's way too early to know if it had any impact or not. But I'd really like to see the organization going forward to continue and remain grounded in that kind of work. I think it's so necessary and so critical as an organization to be able to reach such a broad array of scholars. And again, as a woman of color, it's critical and it's necessary. We need spaces also, and it should not be that we just continue to go through this field feeling as if we're alone and isolated. That's so wrong. And an organization like this is certainly a place that women of color, graduate students, assistant professors, senior faculty should feel is a place for them also. So I really hope that the organization going forward can continue along those lines. So let's give Pamela our last words from the panel. And then when she's done, let's move to discussion and conversation from those who have been attendees. Pamela, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Adia, what you've just said is so important. I would love to have those be the last words, but I just appreciate your service as SWS president, one of our SWS presidents, and what you just said is so important. Something I'm going to mention, or what I'm going to mention, may be happening. I don't know, because I love the SWS e-list. I read it all the time. I get so much out of it, but I've never seen this on it, so I assume it doesn't happen. But I was thinking about women in society. Something we haven't mentioned is our students and our departments in this particular panel. And I was a department chair for 2 different stints, totaling 7 years altogether, at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And yes, I went to the ASA chairs meetings, and I was also for another 4 years director of the graduate doctoral program. And I'm thinking, and of course, this is not something now that I've been retired for 12 years that I'm going to pick up and do, but perhaps it could be thought about in the future. Us as a feminist organization, SWS, if department chairs who are members of SWS could come together, and I could imagine this might even mean that some other department chairs who are not members of SWS might like to join, if they could meet together and bring up the question, from a feminist perspective, what have you learned as a department chair, and how are you reaching out to women students, especially women students of color? How are your faculty? How are you enabling your faculty to reach undergraduate students, women students of color, and all women students, and the same for graduate students? To really help have a network, maybe even a little sub-list, e-list for that. Thank you. And thank you for your leadership of this plenary session, which has been marvelous.
Thank you for saying so. It's been a real joy to be able to have this conversation, to be part of this discussion. So I want now to, a little short under I'd hope for a half hour. We've got 25 minutes, which is still good. But I really want to hear from people who are on the call, but not on the panel. What are some responses that people may have to the really insightful questions that Dana posed for us? What are some thoughts that people have that they'd like to ask any of the particular panelists? Or what are some general reflections that people have that you'd just like to vocalize and share with the group? I think you can either feel free to unmute yourself, or if there gets to be a backlog, this will just feel like my classes and you can raise a hand and I can unmute or call on people.
I raised a hand, but I don't know if I was the first.
Yeah, please go ahead. I didn't see it. Go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. This has been such an exciting panel. I think it's so important for us to think about our history and think about what that means going forward. One of the things that I think about with regard to thinking about historical moments in feminist work is to think of, is that very often what we don't know or what we don't record are the very specific strategies that folks used in certain moments to to combat the structural problems, the structural barriers, right? So I remember very specifically sitting at the bar with Dana having a beer a number of years ago, and Dana was talking about, you know, as the editor of Gender and Society, you know, thinking about things like impact factor. Now, this is one of these kinds of things that seems innocuous. It seems scientific. It seems, you know, whatever. And Dana was like, yeah, but it's a game. Impact factor is a game, right? And we've got to figure out how for feminists to get our work recognized, to game the game, right? And so Dana held a series of, if I recall correctly, symposia, because with the symposia, what happens is the people in the symposium cite the other papers in the symposium, and it automatically increases your impact factor, right? You're sort of gaming the game. And so the point is very clear, pointed strategies to figure out how to overcome these structural barriers. And I guess what I'm thinking about for all the members here is not only to is maybe to point out what some of these kind of strategies have been in the past, but also what kind of strategies we might use in the future to overcome the kind of structural barriers that automatically advantage, you know, the center, whiteness, androcentrism, all of those sorts of things. Thanks.
Those are great comments, thanks. Cecilia, what do you think?
I just wanted to say, and really following up on what Sarah said, is that I think that bringing in the broadest possible group of women into the organization and making them feel welcome from the earliest stages, not only welcome, but it's, as I say, understanding what it's like to be in those places, that has to be the core mission of SWS. It's what it was in the beginning and what it must always be. It certainly was important to me back in, you know, 1973 when I was an assistant professor. I was actually in 1973, believe it or not, I was assistant professor, but 25 years old and freaked out, you know, and SWS was a place I could go. Where you could talk to somebody. And that has to be what it keeps at the center. And the thing to do is to reach to broader and broader groups of women in the world, internationally as well as North, but to keep that at the center. And part of the feeling welcome, there are two aspects to feeling welcome, not just everybody make nice, but also what do we do? What is this game? You know, the whole thing is that when you join academia, it seems like a secret handshake and you don't know it, you know? And somebody people will say, well, this is how it's done, or this is what people do, or this is what that kind of review means. They're not rejecting the paper. You can send it back, you know, you know, how do you interpret this? What sense does it do? So that handing out the knowledge, taking the thing that is hidden and that's exclusive and spreading it out. Yeah. Spreading it out. That's it. Yeah. Spreading it out. Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts or comments from people? And I wonder how Cecilia's thought about spreading it out also connects to some of the things that we've been talking about on this panel, particularly the future of the organization, but maybe also where academia is going, right? Barbara raised the question of public sociology in particular. I think that's an important thing to be mindful of with SWS, with sociology at large, right? We've also talked about perhaps more expansive and inclusive ideas related to gender than in the way that those ideas have changed over time. If we're talking about this idea of spreading it out, that brings some challenges that we know, right, in terms of what that actually means and how to do so in an effective fashion for various groups coming from different backgrounds. What are some of the opportunities and complications there? Manisha, I just saw that your hand is up. Manisha, did you want to comment? You're still muted, I think.
Yeah, I was just trying to unmute. Thank you again, all of you. It's been a great panel and really terrific. And actually, I had a personal reflection that if it wasn't for SWS, I might not actually have my degree because Adia, you were at the institution where I was getting my PhD, that actually I was among the last people before it shut down, the Department of Sociology. And if it wasn't for SWS and actually members, and I particularly want to shout out to Kathy Ward, who was at Southern Illinois University, who I actually went to the provost and said, I had to have somebody from outside the university to let me defend. And to my surprise, he agreed. So, and actually, if it wasn't for Midwest SWS chapter, who told me I could do that, just go and ask. And it works. So I actually just personally want to say that SWS has been great. And when I started going, I was like Veronica, very few women of color at all, grad students or otherwise. And, you know, I had colleagues and friends who didn't come because they said, no, it's for white women. And I said, okay, there are two ways. One is you stop because it's white women, or the other is you go and make yourself visible and just stay there. And I've stayed there now for, I don't know how many years, 20, more than that, since 1989. But actually I also want, so that was just a personal thank you to SWS and all of you. And I remember sitting next to Myra. Myra, you may not even remember this. And it was at a DC meeting way back. And it was amazing to me that I could sit next to Myra, this person who I read and cited. And she was so friendly and supportive and helpful in what I could do and how I could finish. So there's just lots of reasons and ways in which SWS has been extremely helpful for me. But I did want to also sort of talk about the future. And I think I want to echo both what Barbara and Dana said in some ways, which is we really need to think about what social justice means. And I think Dana's comment of we need to get back to the table, to the kitchen table to think about, because I think some of these are contradictory things and we fool ourselves if we think that they're not and we can do it all. Because it's one thing to game the game, but we're still part of the game. And if we want to change the game, then we're going to have to think differently. And so, for example, you know, when we talk about so many other ways, one of the things that we as feminists still don't do very much in our work is to talk about this nation as a settler colony. And if we start with settler coloniality, then what does decolonization mean for feminism and for intersectional feminism? I think opens up different ways of thinking about for part of our organization, because then we'd have to think very differently. We'd have to think about reparations. We'd have to think about so many different things that I think some of what we want to do are a bit in contradiction. And I think, to be honest, we have to have those conversations. And I think then we can go forward. But I look forward to, I don't know that I'll be around for 50 years, but for as long as I'm around, I'm going to be there to participate and to take us forward. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Manisha. Susan, you have a comment.
Adia, and thank you everyone for this wonderful presentation this evening. Just so wonderful hearing the history, so wonderful hearing the history of SWS. I wanted to echo some of the comments previously, especially Veronica's comment about you know, looking overseas, looking at what's happening to women in other parts of the world and making that more of who we are. That's happened in SWS through the international community and our global feminist partnerships. But I'd like to see more of that. You know, I'd really like to an extent, Americans are in a little bubble, you know, being the most powerful nation in the world. And, you know, I'd like to have SWS get out of that bubble a little bit and look more, you know, into other countries. And not that we haven't done it, but just emphasize it more. And I'd also like to echo what Barbara said earlier, that can we be more sociologists for women in society? There are so many deep set problems that remain. And Angela's talk yesterday about violence, you know, the embeddedness of gender-based violence, the pervasiveness, and the pervasiveness of racial discrimination. These are such huge problems, you know, woven into society, certainly here in the US, but around the world as well. And how can SWS bring our scholarship, you know, together with our activism and, you know, bring some sort of, you know, change going forward? I would really just love to see more talk about that and more emphasis.
Thank you, Susan. Are there other comments or thoughts people have? I'm trying to both check the chat and the participants list. To see if
Adia
there's-
Myra's got a raising her hand.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Myra, please proceed. Myra, please feel free to go ahead. You're still muted.
I've got it now. It's actually both of us here hiding as Don. But what I wanted to say, besides how useful this whole history is, to get people to understand how much has changed and how much has stayed the same. One of the things that I often ask of my graduate students was to think about what they thought the universities were going to look like in 20 years or in 30 years, because they were going out and looking for careers in universities in the world. And where did they want to go, and why did they want to go there, and what did they think universities are going to look like? And if we want to think about where SWS is going to go in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, I think we have to think about what we think universities are going to look like in that time period. My own guess is that they're going to be much more globally integrated. They're going to be much more competitive. They're going to be much more precarious. And I'm not entirely sure what that all says about what this younger generation in SWS wants to set as its agenda for transforming the university towards being a place where women of all kinds and persons with gender and feminist agendas of all genders can influence that transformation of universities. Can we build democracy in universities as opposed to watch it get dismantled? I personally have been very impressed with Joan Scott's work with the AAUP, pushing for democracy change within AAUP. And SWS is a very different kind of organization, but what do we think democracy, globalization, precarity, status, the US Anglophone domination is going to look like in 20 or 30 years? What do we want to change in that? And I think that's the question, not for me or Pam Roby or Barbara Rissman or even Dana, but for the people who are now the graduate students or just barely postdocs and assistant professors, because that's going to be their career trajectory. And how do they want SWS to change that world for them?
Thanks, Mara. That's great food for thought. And it made me realize we've heard a lot from people who've spent more time with the organization, rightfully so, and that makes sense given that we're talking about 50 years. But I hope that those of us who are on the call who are newer faculty or graduate students or postdocs, like Myra said, I'd certainly welcome and would like to hear thoughts from people who are newer to the organization about relating to Myra's questions about what the organization might look like in their future and what they might want the organization to look like in the future. What could it offer? How could it be most effective? What would you want to see and need and get out of SWS in the 50 years going forward into a future that's going to change and look a lot different from what we're looking at now? I think this is Heather with a hand raised. Heather, please go ahead.
Hi. So I'm in the middle, I think. I think my first SWS was maybe in 1996. So I think I was about, halfway through the organization, and I literally wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have gone to graduate school. I wouldn't have gotten through graduate school. Well, I would have gone to graduate school because that's when I was introduced to the organization, but I would have gotten through. I wouldn't have gotten tenure. None of the things. My dissertation is, I interviewed some of you. And I'm in the middle. So I remember, reading Patricia Hill Collins as an undergraduate and thinking, well, obviously this has been around forever because duh. And then realizing, oh no, So it's like 2 years ago. And I feel like we're in another moment right now where that kind of really amazing thinking is happening. And so I feel like the graduate students now, we have so much to learn from. And I just feel really excited to think about what they might have to teach us and to help us sort of going forward. And I know like that sounds like you have to do the work. But I don't think that's true. I think that like those of us in the middle can do the work, but that we have a lot to learn from those who are thinking about things and experiencing things in a different way. So I don't know, I get all like, SWS is really important for me, and I hope that we can make ourselves the organization that can be for the folks coming up what it's been for some of us, and that we can make it better for more of us. So.
Well said.
Great comments. Thank you, Heather. So we've still got some time left and time for comments from people who have not had a chance yet to weigh in. And again, I really want to encourage people who are on the call who are early career, mid-career, graduate students. I would really like to encourage people in those career stages to weigh in with your own thoughts as well about how you found the organization so far, what you'd like to see it do in the future, and how it could best meet your needs in the future. I'll warn you that probably the response that you'll get will be encouragement to run for office, but that's a good thing because that's how things get done. It looks like Jennifer has a hand raised. Jennifer, go ahead.
Thanks for this great panel and thanks for the different voices. I've been in SWS for about 15 years, so I guess maybe I'm in the middle. And I came because some friends said, you have to join. It's this magical place to talk to other people about the problems of our profession. As a first-year assistant professor, I really needed that. What I was thinking about listening to this and reflecting on some of Dana's comments about the tail wagging the dog, right? The problems of the different relationship to the journal, to the money, to the mandate, to where we are, is I've seen some ebbs and flows in the organization. I've seen some very heated arguments and battles. And what's I think makes them so challenging is because they're passionate. And I think what that speaks to is that SWS is a lot of different things, and that it makes it uncomfortable in a way that I think we should keep. For some people, it is a place for professional socialization and to figure out how to gain skills to move up in an institution. And these are not mutually exclusive categories, but I think it's an activist space to figure out new tools and new networks for moving and creating change. I think it's emotionally supportive source of a network for a lot of us too. And it's fraught. And there have been I think I can think of windows where there were generational tensions about when young people felt that they should take leadership or should be allowed to take leadership. I can think of like, really struggles about when I was on the publications committee about what the role of the journal is and how we live up to the original vision or not. And in looking back, I see the power of those conversations as ongoing and unresolved. And I think over time, I'm becoming fond of that tension, that we have to keep being lots of different things, because if we came to one kitchen table with one unifying vision, it would be at the exclusion of, I think, a lot of other potentialities, and I would miss all of those things, even if they're not my primary reason for being here.
Great, that's really well put, Jennifer, thank you. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to actually reopen keep the space open for comments and discussion that we've been having, but I also want to just reopen the space for people who'd like to share reflections. I feel like from what I'm seeing in the chat, people seem to be kind of in a reflective mood, and I think that a lot of the comments have sparked people thinking about what the organization has meant and connections that they've made and what it's brought to them. So given that that was one of the questions that was open to the panelists, I'd really like to give people who are attendees and participants a chance to share any comments that anyone wants to offer about what they feel the organization has brought to them or what they've been able to gain from it. And of course, feel free to offer other comments that don't relate to that if you want to, but I just want to make that opportunity for people to share anything that they've been able to gain from the organization as we reflect on the past 50 years and think about the next 50 years. Roberta.
Well, it's a little bit difficult to articulate something at this time tonight, but I'm gonna try. I think I'm very grateful for this panel. I'm president-elect. I think, I don't know if I'm already or I'll be tomorrow, but this is giving me a lot of ideas, some of them confirming what I was thinking about the next meeting, but also what I think I'm committing myself now in public is that I'm gonna do a survey so we get a better sense, like from everybody, what do you think SWS should look like, right, in the next 50 years, and hopefully gather some input, not just for planning the meeting, but thinking about structurally, like what we can do, because I echo so many things that have been said. There are other things that I never thought about, and I'm pretty sure that if we open this up even more, right, beyond the 85 people who are here today, we'll be able to hopefully continue to think about the organization in a way that is, I guess, a word that was brought up, right, more democratic and bringing in that input in a more systematic way, I guess. And then I also wanted to add, like, to me, you know, I don't know, probably you were not watching my video, hopefully, but when Veronica was speaking, I was just starting to cry, so emotional, because there's so many layers of what's happening and what's happened in the last several years. I think I joined SWS it was in Santa Barbara, the one with the Nice Wood. I can't remember what year was that. Was that 2010 or something like that? And I would have never imagined now becoming president, right? And it was because SWS was welcoming, and it was because they were really intentionally working through all of these exclusionary problems that were there. And so what I liked about the organization was that they were not fearful to deal with the challenges that were in front of their faces, and they were not fearful to dealing with things that weren't pretty to deal with. So I'm very excited to have this chance now, but I'm also very grateful because I would have not been able to survive anything that happened since I became an assistant professor without SWS, and I'm also very thankful for that. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you, Roberta. I think that's a perfect way to end the discussion, particularly as we're thinking about going to the future, as you will be the president next coming up. So I want to just take a moment again to, one, thank everybody for attending. I know I've mentioned being on Central Time, but it's even later for all of you who are on the East Coast. So if you're not a night owl, thanks for staying up and being part of this discussion. And I want to again thank Maggie, Jean, Veronica, Dana, Barbara, and especially Pamela Roby for being a part of a really interesting and just far-ranging and I think really important discussion and conversation. I'd also like to again thank Barrett for her help getting everything set up, and last but not least, to thank our current president, Mignon, for setting up what is a fabulous meeting and just doing amazing work, particularly under circumstances that I know she did not envision when I asked her to run for this office. This was not at all, I know, what she had in mind, but she is handling it gracefully and putting together an amazing meeting in spite of circumstances that none of us could have predicted. So thank you everybody for being part of this, and thank you to attendees, panelists, and everybody connected with the organization for helping to make it what it is. So Mignon, did you want to make any final comments before ending?
Oh, I feel my heart is full, and it's been very nice to hear from everyone. And you know, my vision is to try to create community in different ways, and we can create community. You know, we can talk about things that we didn't like and things that we did like, and I like the energy that we have, you know, on this panel. So thank you so much, Adia, for your leadership on this panel, and thank you everyone for participating this evening.